Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Zeus back again. This time to help you learn how to read an academic paper. In so many classes, not just in subjects like emotion and motivation, you will find yourself engaging academic papers that look like they go on and on and on and use 5 words where they could use one. So for the typical person that's looking to get concise information or is required to read an academic paper, it can be a little disconcerting. A lot of people have full-time jobs, have family lives, and then they get 3 or 4 academic papers thrown their way. They don't know exactly how to go through it, and oftentimes get lost in the words, take many more hours than they thought, reread it again. I'm basically going to show you how you can derive relevant information for your assignments and for your purposes and your interests, if you're doing it for professional development, in a fraction of the time and with more substance and with better connections made. This is done with the understanding that I'm trying to help you develop capabilities, the capacities, the capacity to be capable, that is to understand the material, but to go through it smartly instead of just taking a long time, to be critical and be able to challenge the reading that you see, to be creative, that is, see moments of possible application into your life, effective and imaginative application, and finally, compassion, to see how this might inform your relationships with other people. I'm not a big fan of the way in which a lot of academic writing is done. It's kind of its own monastery. It's got its own jargon. But if you don't get too intimidated and you allow yourself to be brought brought yourself to it without letting it overwhelm you, it can actually be a great learning tool and learning moment for you. So let's go right now to 2 academic articles that are signed in the one class I'm teaching, and I will right away show you what I mean. Here is an article called Solving the Emotion Paradox, Categorization, and the Experience of Emotion by Linda Feldman Barrett. I got an approximate word count on this. That's 20,000 words, about 1,000 words per page on this article. That's about 80 double space type pages. It would take you forever to get through that, at least a couple of hours if it wasn't written in a highly technical jargon for the most part. And basically, and I'm going to go basically to the punchline first, it really comes up with 2 very simple, here I'm going over here, simple models of emotion, of what an emotion is. There's this one, the past one, which she refers to as the entity model. It also talked about engrams. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's hers, which is more the constructivist, conceptual, or categorical understanding of emotion. Basically, it's quite simple. In the old model over here, okay, there's basically this notion of a causal mechanism, some kind of stimulus, some essence, right, essentially drives emotion, okay? In this sense, and it creates an entity, an emotion that then creates the experience. The person is not really engaged so much as driven by emotion. They're not motivating the emotion, they're motivated by it. And it kind of comes in sideways and kind of makes them do things. Now, the Barrett is saying, no, actually the emotion isn't the causer, it's the thing that is caused by a feeling that is then constructed into a concept or a category by the brain, and then it's experienced as an embodied emotion. That, in the nutshell, is what this article is saying for 80,000 words. And she obviously goes to great lengths to allow people to color that in. As I said in one of my introductions, and it's here at the very top here, read broadly enough to gain context and read deeply enough to reach substance. That's basically my motto. That's what I'm going to run in this session on reading an academic paper. Again, the first thing you do is to read the abstract, which is this thing here. It pretty much will tell you, if you read nothing else, what the entire article is about in very few words. And being able to pick out the major sentence in there is important. I've underlined the major sentence. People experience an emotion when they conceptualize an instant of affective feeling. In this view, the experience of emotion is an act of categorization. You have a feeling, your brain categorizes it as something, then you experience an emotion. That's basically what she's saying. That's the constructivist or conceptual or categorical understanding of it. That's what she's offering. So again, the feeling is this inchoate or disorganized thing. It hits you, you have this feeling in your body. Your brain decides then to categorize that feeling. It categorizes anger, sadness, whatever, and then you experience the emotion. That's what she's saying. The other ones are kind of the opposite. It's not like the movie, it's a little bit like the movie Inside Out, the Disney movie that was a big hit just a couple of days, where you have these little entities inside. You get anger, sadness, and so forth. Anyway, they're doing their job. And in other words, they're making you feel sad or feel angry. There's these, almost like there's these little places in you, little guys on your shoulder, the devil and the angel, doing that. What's interesting about that film, and I would recommend everyone see it because it really works for this, and I'm really willing even to do extra credit on this, is that you get a really great understanding from Inside Out, the Disney movie, about the entity-oriented understanding of emotion. That's the one that Barrett is arguing against. So that's kind of the background of this. I'm going to keep on going up. I've gone ahead and just scanned some pages with my scribbles on them to give you an idea about how I look. Remember, this is like 20 pages long, and I'm really just taking out the things I think that will really help. The Disney film Inside Out, I've got that mentioned up here. Why does it feel to us like an entity? A lot of you discuss emotional impulse and then kind of liken that to emotion. But emotional impulse is more unconscious, and an emotion is a little bit more conscious. A lot of times we're driven because we're caught up in something. We just get so frustrated, we just throw everything off the table. That would feel like an emotion is driving you. And if it's in an unconscious state, yes, the entity-oriented notion of emotion does explain it better than her notion. When you're not thinking, when it's unconscious, when it's reactive, when it's immediate, just like Newtonian physics, there's certain models that work for certain phenomena. So the entity emotion model could work for one, and her model could also work for others. So I'm just pulling it out. Unitary faculties of the mind, entities, if you will, to thinking about them as emergent phenomena. That's what she's going from, thinking them as entities to emergent phenomena. Entities that drive you to emergent phenomena that produce emotions. Each one of us is assumed to be a fixed entity. This is in the entity orientation of emotion, and that's driven by some causal mechanism. I'm gonna keep flying along here. Blah 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 blah. I'm saying, okay. And every once in a while I pick these out. I said, thank you here. A quick look at the empirical evidence suggests that it is difficult, if not impossible, to find an objective means of measuring the experience of emotion. So I said, thank you on that because I like to make comments in the margin. I'm like, yeah, so you guys really don't know. There's a lot of different theories that describe different kinds of phenomenon, and you're just trying to go ahead and do your best at helping to add to that knowledge. There's no one definitive theory on emotion. That's the important thing to know. And many of the theories of emotion handle different classes of emotion and ways of experiencing emotion. So if you're looking for the magic bullet, you're not going to find it in academia. And with something as complex as emotion, I don't think you'll find it anywhere. Okay, I had to turn the light on to make sure that I could see a little bit better here. Okay, notice I said skipped pages, noted headings, realized that they were very detailed. So I went through about 5 to 7 pages and just skimmed through the headings. And they were details about that underlying statement she had made. Notice when you come across summaries, that's a good place. It will summarize a lot of what you've already read. You can go right to the summary. The order of priority is this. When you're asked the question in your class, in this class, we're asking the question, name 2 contrasting theories about what an emotion is. Go right to that. Look through your 4 articles. Find out which article is dealing with different theories of emotion. Zoom in on that. Then go to the summary and the abstract to find out what the thesis is. Go first to answering the question and then pan back. A lot of people are like, well, I can't answer this question unless I read everything. No, actually go narrow first. then pan back. Read broadly enough for context so you understand the context of that question, but deeply enough to reach the substance that will help you answer the actual question. She mentions this, that the experience of emotion cannot be measured objectively. Others have tried to do that, but as you can imagine, something as complex as emotion isn't that easy. So second, discrete emotion experiences are not psychologically primitive. I think that's what she's saying. They're not just urges that drive us. Okay, where are we going to go with that? Bam, let's keep going. She outlines the emotion paradox. The devil made me do an understanding of emotion. And the entity notion. She says, people over here, we're over here where I have my underline here, people experience anger as erupting or happening to them, so that it seems as if an anger mechanism hijacks the mind and the body and presumably causing people to behave in ways they would rather not. And frankly, there are definitely episodes where that is a good explanation. When a person is drunk, or they don't have a lot of capacity and faculty of their mind, or they happen to be mentally ill. Something like that actually kind of makes sense. So it does handle some phenomena. It's not completely get rid of that, but it doesn't handle all of them, especially when we're trying to develop our emotional capacity consciously to respond. That's why I have over here mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is helping us deal with impulse by allowing us to develop consciousness about how we understand, receive, and field stimuli and our emotions. And through breathing, through training the mind to respond in different ways, a lot of times we go from unconscious to conscious. That is, driven by an emotion or our actions caused by an emotion, to one in which instead we have an intervening understanding or disposition that we've built, so that when a frightening thing happens to us, instead of freaking out, we actually calm down. This happened when I was a lifeguard. I learned that when someone was about drowning or thrashing around, I went into this mode of hyper-rationality and clarity. I'm really ticking through all the things I needed to do to ensure that that person could be saved, but that I wouldn't be putting myself in danger. That's an example of not freaking out. Now, there have been people who freaked out in that situation, jumped in, and they didn't even know how to swim, and you had 2 people drowned. So they had such concern and such alarm that they actually did something that endangered their own lives. So again, we're going to keep on going through. Like I said here, I skipped many pages. You know, I could see that they're just detailed renderings of the main points. So I skipped past those, okay? And here, I always put yikes over here because the language is crazy. I'm a PhD. I've read these academic papers, and they still don't even make sense to me sometimes. I'm like, you can say this so much clearer. So just to just tease the academic language here a little bit and to say, what are you actually saying? I'm going to read it out loud. The conceptual act model of emotion is not a deconstruction of emotional phenomena as much as it is an attempt to sketch a construction of an emotional event from basic psychological processes and their neural correlates. Taken together, the basic proposition of the conceptual act model of emotion map a novel research agenda, and it goes on. I'm like, guys, just say it. When you start heading it, don't panic. Don't let your eyes glaze over. Just say, okay, you know, I see what you're saying. It's not really that relevant to my topic. I'm staying on task here. Moving, oh, here we have it, to a summary. And then there'll usually be a couple of really succinct sentences that give you all you really need to know, not only to answer the question in class, but a lot of what the article is trying to say. Unless you're a researcher, and there are a few in the class that want to go on to be PhDs and MAs, you might want to come back and read it more carefully if you have time. If you don't, my more streamlined method is going to be helpful even for you. There's no way to be able to read every one of these carefully, have a full-time job, a full-time family, and like many do, unless you're completely devoted to this. And if you are, God bless you, but most people are not. So in the summary, it says, again, I have argued that the way people learn about emotions categories and use conceptual emotion determines what they see and feel. So she's saying there are learned structures or algorithms that we have in our brain that really determine in many ways what we feel and what we see around emotions. This would explain people who are presented with the same stimulus, you know, a car crashing, whatever. One person completely freaks out. It's the same stimulus. The other person gets into a mode of calmness, maybe even a readiness to help. The other one's running the other direction. Why, if we have the same brains and emotions are driving us, and they're not based in context, would one person do one thing and one person do another? A lot of it has to do with, again, the way she correctly understands is the way we've developed our knowledge and our responses consciously. So now things are getting a little bit interesting, and we skipped a lot of the stuff, right? She mentions up here that there are a lot of things that get in the way. Variation in conceptualizing, that's why different people or even the same person in different situations varies in the response because of context. Variation in conceptualizing an instance of emotion, whether because of language use, context, culture, or individual difference in prior experience, will produce variation in which emotion is experienced and how it is experienced. That actually kind of makes sense. It's a little self-evident, but it's nice to have that related. Oh, these are beautiful. Here we are way into this. And now all of a sudden, she has this great little chart that has the entity-oriented natural kind view and the conceptual-oriented categorization view, which is her view. And she uses how many kinds of emotions, brain mechanisms, the role of evolution. She goes through this entire thing, kind of creates the contrast. So if you have any doubt about the two models, these provide more than enough detail. You could probably just work with the summaries, this chart, and the abstract at the beginning and the conclusion, and you're going to get pretty much what you need out of this. Again, if you're in a deeper research project, you come back and you can read it with greater, particularity. So finally, again, we're back to the conclusions. Why does this matter is what I've said in the past, okay? I haven't underlined anything. Well, I have underlined this real quick. Emotions are not causal entities, but are states that are caused and can be explained. That's really the punchline here. Why does that matter? First of all, I have to say, in some instances, we are caused by our emotions, especially in unconscious, and that other model does work. So I think she's being a little too extreme here. And in many cases, she's correct, especially if we work on and can interact with our emotions. Why does this matter? This is important if we only had the other model, because we would say literally we have no power over our emotions. They come up, they interfere with our rational minds and decision makings, and it's kind of over, right? So you become much more of a product of your upbringing and the ways in which you've been taught to engage emotions. And to a certain extent, when they're powerful, they just take you over. When the emotions are not the causers, right here, and this is my messy writing, but they are caused, you have much more control over them. You can intervene consciously. Your brain is partly within that. So that's why that is important. And again, this is basically it. Here I've gone in 18 minutes over an article that would have taken hours upon hours upon hours. A little postscript on this article, and this drives me crazy about academia. This woman has 198 bibliographic entries, almost 200 bibliographic entries, 5 pages, which I have not showed you, including, and this is up here, 13 citations of herself. So we're kind of motivated by tenure, and we're motivated by a publishing interest here. I'm not going to say this is a bad motivation. If you're in academia, you get promoted on this basis. But again, when it comes to other people, it might be a little bit more consideration. And it oftentimes is better. These same people, this person and others, will do a YouTube video to a popular crowd, and they will summarize their article in about 4 or 5 minutes. So one way to get context on these articles sometimes is just to type their name into YouTube and a couple keywords, and they will have a 5 to 10 minute video which explains exactly these things in a PowerPoint slide or something else that you can go to, use as a background to go through the article, pick out the more relevant things, and off you go. We've done this in less than 20 minutes. We've really developed the more important aspects of this, and we're pretty much done. We can apply it to the question, and on we go. I'm not expecting, and no one can expect you, to spend 8 hours just doing the academic readings, which is about what a beginner would need to spend, or even a person in an undergraduate level would need to spend with a lot of this material. The sheer volume of it and the sheer technical jargon of it would take you quite a long time. So save yourself the emotional worry, get the context, see the YouTube video around it, pull out the things you need, go toward the summaries, the abstract, and the conclusion, And then write in the margins. If you don't agree with something, challenge it, right? Put a little some notation in the margin. If you want to see its relevance, how it could be applied, even ask a question, or boom, you could say, okay, wait a minute, I know how to apply this stuff. And then get an interesting understanding of it. So here I am at the second article. This is Emotion Review. This is toward a working definition of emotion by Mulligan and Shearer. Now, this article drew me. It's 2 of the 4 articles. And again, if you just happen to be seeing this video outside of our class, then just pause the screen and look it up. There it is. So I'm going down. This is how I do things. You notice Kevin Mulligan is actually a philosopher. It turns out he's an analytical philosopher, which drives me crazy. But at least philosophy drives me. And again, the abstract shows you in very few terms what the actual paper is about. And usually within the abstract, you can find the thesis statement, what they're actually trying to prove or elucidate. And it says here, our aim here is more modest. We propose a list of elements for a working definition of emotion and discuss the justification for the inclusion of elements from our respective perspectives. This working partial definition may at least serve as a litmus test to examine theories of emotion. So they're trying to create kind of attributes. Well, as you can imagine, I kind of lit into this paper. So if you enjoy ripping into academic papers, then just stay tuned. So here we go. This one won't take that long. I hope to spend about 10 minutes on this, so the whole video will be about 30 minutes, maybe 35. So again, part of what's going here, and again, I do things like emotion, cultural differences. That just jumped up at me. So I'm going along here. They're defining having an emotion, designating an episode. So to them, having an emotion has to do with a beginning and an end, an episode with a beginning and an end. Again, if you start looking at these things like having an emotion and delimited, you notice that there's a scientific bias to understanding human being as a mechanism, right? As an observable gear. That's one of the problems of science. As the history of science will show, many of these disciplines, including psychology, came out of the industrial age, when they believed that everything was an intricate machine and could literally be broken down into parts so that everything could be managed. Turns out we're a lot more organic and complex than that. And science sometimes, especially with that mechanistic bias, cannot actually work very well. So let's keep going. Here's a proposed working partial definition. It says, it is an episode. It involves an episode. Then I said, well, wait a minute. Chronic depression is not an episode. It's a long-lasting thing. Well, they go on later to say, well, that's a different kind of thing. It's like a feeling or something else. It involves some appraisal of good or bad, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so they're trying to just break it down into different aspects. They do say, which is good, that part of the reason we have confusion in this area is that, popularly speaking, emotion, feeling, affect, and even preferences, emotional attitudes, moods, and dispositions sometimes get collapsed. So this is sometimes where academia is actually helpful. It tries to make distinctions between these common sense, word on the street collapsing of things, like feeling and mood and so forth. That can be helpful, because it's nice to know what you're referring to and to make some distinctions when we use language. Oftentimes in just normal language, we don't do that. So again, I'm not trying to totally dog academia. It has its uses, but sometimes it goes a little too far with them. So I said conscious versus unconscious, mental versus bodily. So I'm trying to look at contrasts and distinctions here. A conscious mental reaction as anger or fear, subjectively experienced as strong feeling, usually directed toward a specific object, typically accompanied by physiological and behavioral changes in the body. Actually, I think that's a pretty good one. That's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of an emotion. It's got the notion of physiological and behavioral changes. It's usually, not always, directed toward a specific object, and it's a conscious, in this case, conscious mental reaction. I would not necessarily say conscious. I think you can have emotions, you can be conscious of the emotion, but it can be very impulse or unconsciously driven. So it's not actually a bad definition. They go back and talk about episodes and emotional states or dispositions, and the difference between a momentary outburst of anger or fleeting admiration of an elegant angle on the one hand, ankle on the one hand, and the long-lasting hatred of the nationalist or the reverence of a religious believer on the other. Again, this has to do with, and they try to make a distinction between dispositions, that is, these long-lasting sort of emotional things that seem to reside in the body, and more of these episodes. That's an important and a good distinction to make. Ideology could be one of those long-lasting things. A lot of times people talk about talk radio developing a disposition of people to see the world in certain ways and react emotionally, consistently, maybe against difference or against changes in a country, for instance. So again, I don't have any problem challenging these things. Philosophers called episodes occurrence, right? And like they happen to you. They are things which happen. That doesn't, I don't like that. I make a critical challenge. I said, no, we're involved. We can be involved. Our emotions are in an interaction and relationship with us. If we treat those emotions, we develop different responses, we train ourselves differently, or we educate ourselves. Let's say we have fear around outsiders or foreigners, and then we meet one, and then we have a good relationship. And then we meet another one on the street. We're not going to respond in the same way. They don't just happen to us. They happen in the short term to us, but in the long term, we learn to interact with them. That's the reason why many of our emotional reactions change as we learn about something or get used to it. We can't afford to keep developing anxiety every time we see difference, so we begin to accommodate. So again, oftentimes what you'll see in these academic things is they're emphasizing one thing to the exclusion of another. So don't buy it wholesale. A lot of times they're trying to form their own village industry where their model is the presiding model, so they oftentimes will oversell, their theory or their ideas. Usually there's some merit to it, said probably in far too many words, but don't be too caught up in theirs, okay? Usually there's some merit to one theory or another, but the author is so attached to it, speaking of emotion, so emotionally attached to it, and their tenure and their reputation as a scholar is attached to its preeminence, that they tend to oversell it, okay? So here we go. Here's another one that drove me crazy. I said, no. It says, as many philosophers have argued, we're over here, intentionality. What is essential to emotions is that they have or appear to have an object. And I'm like, no, they don't. Generalized, and this is my messy scrawl over here, generalized anxiety does not have an object. That's why it's an emotion. Literally, anxiety is the emotion that arises when you can't put to coherent, or can't articulate or put into focus an object. You don't know what's bothering you. That creates you anxiety. You have this odd sense of dread or fear around you, but you're not exactly sure of what. So again, emotion, they could say, well, that's not really an emotion, that's something else. And I said, no, anxiety really is an emotion, and it really doesn't have an object. So you don't have to, again, agree with these guys. They can be experts, and they aren't always right. Again, here's another way of demonstrating as a little bit of a humor break. Sometimes the crazy speech, just hear me saying this and watch your eyes roll back into your head. The appraisal and evaluation of objects, overview. Usually I say go to the overview because that's going to help you in just one paragraph, but this overview is crazy. I'll just read it and let's see how it hits you. Speaking of emotions, the objects in our wide sense of emotion have an impact on the individual that justifies or seems to justify the perturbation and commotion that is engendered. It is generally assumed that this impact is due to an evaluation of the significance of the object to the organism. The word evaluation has a cognitivistic ring to it. And it's like, but then they finally get to the point. Here's the thing, and it's just one line. I've underlined it. But how much cognition is needed to have an emotion at all? There's your question. What's with all the gobbledygook? And then, boom, they're going to go into it. So one line is really all you have to pick out. So even in an overview or a summary, sometimes there's a lot of gobbledygook. Just learn to zero in on the gist of it and use your pencil and underline it. And just forget the rest. If you try to make sense of it, it's just going to drive you crazy. I just did this to show you that this guy is an analytical philosopher. I'm a philosopher, but I like to I'm an applied philosopher. I don't just do prepositions. X is a good boy. X is good, bad for Y. X is better or worse than Y. I don't, to me, that's not how we normally go through life. We don't go through a rationalistic computer-like process to determine good and bad with emotions or really anything else. So I don't see a lot of use in this kind of thing. It's more of an exercise, an abstract exercise that maybe a long time down the road could be brought to some use. But for the most part, no. I use duh here because sometimes academic papers will state the obvious, okay? Like emotions are based on evaluations and appraisals of the significance or relevance of something. It's like, no kidding. We don't have emotions to those things we don't care about. Oh, thank you for that, blazingly like precise insight I never would have had I not read this paper. So in my research, it's called salience. That is, and I'll give you an example why this is important. In self-esteem, what a lot of self-esteem tests failed to show people was failed to take into consideration when they made their conclusions was the salience or relevance of what they were testing to the people. For instance, they were saying, well, these gang members tested low on academics and feelings toward academics. Therefore, they have low academic self-esteem. And the answer is no, they don't. They actually get high self-esteem out of doing poorly in school. Literally poor in school is proving that they're really tough guys, and they don't go for that. So their self-esteem is actually increased by their poor school performance rather than lowered. And if you don't get that distinction and you try to, get them to be involved and enjoy school, instead of finding a way to create learning for them that engages their need to be tough and their need to be critical and their need to be cool, then you're probably not going to work, because you have made the wrong assessment in terms of what is relevant to them. You've used your own assumptions instead. So this is very important for all of you out there who are caring professionals. Oftentimes you're doing your darndest to care for people, okay? You're pouring your heart out. You're taking time away from your family. And guess what? In some cases, you're creating what's called learned helplessness, a situation where the person you're caring for begins to rely upon you and your energy to do the things that they need to do for themselves, okay? Then oftentimes what happens, you get frustrated and you step back and you say, I've had it with this, especially when you're given 600 cases, if you're a social worker for the state and it's, the budget isn't so enough to really pay you for your work. And that oftentimes I've witnessed that many times with teaching. What instead you have to do is develop an emotional intelligence about how your caring is working for them. Is it developing learned helplessness, or is it helping them develop capacities and strengths for themselves? One of the ways I do this is I really put the focus on them in terms of what can you contribute or give into this situation. And I help them gain confidence in their own learning style and their own way of coming forward into the world. It's a little bit like physical rehabilitation therapy. It's like you can do it. You're walking along that line after a bad accident, and you're very steady, you're very supportive, and you're there with them, but you don't do the work for them. They have to go through the painful process, often painful process of coming to better and more healthy understandings in the case of rehab with their body, but it's also true emotionally. Now, here's one thing that actually is relevant, okay, to our work. One of the questions we asked, okay, was what is the difference between feeling and emotion? And they actually somewhat addressed this in this paper here. What is the difference between having an emotion and feeling something? We have not included feeling as a necessary condition in our list of features, and it goes on to say it. The main issue they have is that feeling is too, quote, and it's circled around here, indeterminate. It's too fuzzy. So basically you're saying we can't measure it. That's why we're not going to deal with it. So it's hard to develop components for something you can't measure. I've already said in my previous, I have a pretty, check my other video about what is an emotion. I do talk about the difference between feeling and emotion, I think in a fairly straightforward terms and in fairly short terms. So I'm trying to think if that's basically the last page. And that's it. We've done it in 34 minutes. You've gone through two academic papers that if you were to try to read carefully on your own would take a long time, a very long time. So consider this a tutorial. Again, to summarize, when you are addressing an academic paper, pay attention to the abstract, see what their thesis is, underline the couple of sentences in the abstract that really gears you toward the paper, okay? Flip through the paper and look at overviews and summaries of sections. Circle that, go down through the summary and underline the words that seem to be the punchline or the sentences that seem to be the punchline, okay? Go to the conclusion. Circle that. Go down through the conclusion, say, okay, this is what they're saying. This is what they've gotten out of it, all right? After you've done that, then look for specific examples that relate to your work, that relate to the question, and so forth, okay? If you do that, you will be able to do a much better job. You will have more or less reviewed the whole paper, but you've done it in a very efficient and clean way that's not going to disrupt your time. Especially if you're pushed for time, this is important. You're focusing into the sections at work, and within the section, even the sentences that really help you deal with the question. You can reference that section, you can reference that line in APA style, and you've taken care of showing the professor that you've read it and that you referenced it. And since it's not just on the first page that you've referenced, but maybe the last page or some page in between, they'll think you have actually read the entire article if they're a real stickler. I'm not. I realize you have time. You have a limited amount of time, and that you want to do this most efficiently. And if you have time, do go back. If it's an area that does, in fact, draw you, go back and read it in more detail. But it's probably better to start with that more straightforward and targeted approach. So I hope this has been helpful. And until next time, we'll see you. Dr. Zeus signing out. Thanks.